Hello there and welcome to the channel. This is Nerd.World History, and today we are looking at a 10th century wife and mother who you would not want to mess with, Saint Olga of Kiev. Before we get into her story, I should tell you this video is sponsored by my sponsors, Relentless Rebels. They are linked in the description below, but we'll talk about them in just a minute. For now, let's get into the story. The very dark story of Saint Olga of Kiev. In advance, I should apologize. I'm going to be making a lot of pronunciations from a language that I am not even going to pretend I know how to pronounce properly, so there are going to be some mispronunciations, so apologies up front. Saint Olga of Kiev, to put some background context on her first, was born in 903 approximately, and was born into the Kievan Rus Empire. This was an empire north of the Black Sea that encompassed areas of what are now modern-day Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, and others. Based on its name, obviously, these nations would trace some of their lineage to this ancient empire, but also the nations of Russia and Belarus would actually trace the name of their particular states to this original empire. She was the wife of the king of the Kievan Rus Empire, which, as I said, as like many Dark Age empires, it expanded quite violently and quite bloodily and had complex relations with its neighbours as a consequence. They often fought against the Byzantines in alliance with one of their neighbours, who are going to become more important in a minute to this story. Now, as I said, the Kievan Rus Empire could be very violent and had often fought against the Byzantines. It had allied itself with one of its neighbours in military campaigns against said enemy, a nation who I will apologise for as I'm about to butcher their pronunciation, called the Drevlians. The Drevlians. They has, of course, had a complicated relationship with this neighbour. The Drevlians were forced to pay tribute to the Kievan Rus Empire, and of course that was something they didn't enjoy doing, and in 912 they just simply stopped. Now, eventually, many years later, Igor, the king of the Kievan Rus Empire and husband to Olga, would decide he was going to try to enforce the old pact, get things back to how they used to be, and get the Drevlians paying their tribute again and reassert the dominance of the Kievan Rus Empire in the region. Now again, he decided to travel quite provocatively straight to their capital, which is now in the nation of Ukraine. He travelled straight there, and he was not given a warm reception when he arrived in, apologies for this pronunciation, Iskoristan. I know that's not even close. Which is now the city of Koristan in northern Ukraine. They captured him, and they tied his body to 2 bent trees. Upon giving the order, after some merriment, the trees were released, ripping his body apart. This was done as a visceral display of how much disrespect they had for the Kievan Rus Empire. Either way, that is not a way to go for anybody. With his death, his 3-year-old son was technically now the king, but of course was not old enough to rule, so Olga stepped in his stead as regent to rule over the Kievan Rus Empire until the young prince was of age. Now, with the brutal demise of her husband and her young son, one day to take the throne, Olga realized the threat the Drevlians now posed. She had enough experience in court with her husband and with her own people to know exactly what the Drevlians were going to plan next. There was only one outcome that could come from this, other than war. It was clear the Drevlians had plans. The fact that they were so blatant in their destruction of the old treaty, the fact that they were so readily willing to murder a ruler of a foreign power, they clearly had aspirations of empire of their own. As a result, the Drevlians, who believed that they were dealing with nothing more than a grieving widow and regent, she knew that they were a direct threat to her son and herself and her people. The Drevlians believed that they could simply marry off this frail woman to their Prince Mal, and as a result they would no longer have to pay tribute to the Kievan Rus, but also would now become the rulers of the Kievan Rus Empire, making themselves the dominant power north of the Black Sea. As a result, they sent 20 members of the court to try to convince Olga that she should marry the prince and unify the two kingdoms. She instructed these men to wait by their boat while she could prepare an adequate reception for them, and overnight she had several of her enclave dig a large pit. The next morning the 20 men were gathered together, thrown in the pit and buried alive. With this, Olga then sent word, not just leaving it at that, to the Drevlian court and to their ruler, asking that she would accept his marriage proposal, but obviously she needed to make some kind of symbol out of it, as the people might be a little offended by her marrying the living symbol of the man who killed their king and her husband. She insisted that she be given a royal escort, a great escort of the great and good of the Drevlian people, to show just how important this union was going to be. The Drevlians obliged, not hearing back from their first dispatch. But nah, it'll be fine, right? They sent these men, and of course she then snatched them all up. Once they arrived, she had prepared a lavish welcome for them, and invited them all to bathe and get cleaned up in her private bathhouse. They all obliged, went in there, began to relax. She locked the doors and set the building on fire, killing all of them. Then, not leaving it at that, because this story gets so much worse, she then sent word again to the Drevlians that she was prepared to come and marry them. She would travel to their kingdom, but they had to have some measure of recognition of her husband. She insisted that a funeral feast be prepared, where they would all toast to the former king and her former husband, and to his memory. To which the Drevlians once again agreed, still not having heard back from any of the great and good and powerful of their said kingdom. She arrived with several of her soldiers, and they began to drink and be merry and engage in the great feast and toast of her husband Igor's demise in the capital of the very nation that had killed him. Once all of the remaining great and good of the Drevlians were suitably inebriated, she ordered her soldiers to put them all to death, which they gleefully did. Now the final chapter of her vengeance may have a measure of hyperbole to it, but the story as chronicled, the people of the Drevlians begged for mercy. She seemed to soften as they offered honey and furs and other tribute in exchange for their lives. She had gathered a large army to wipe out her enemy once and for all. She seemed to soften, although they really hadn't seemed to learn a lesson, had they, by this point. She said that unlike her husband, she was not interested in imposing such heavy taxation and tribute upon them. She knew that they were impoverished and beaten from the siege. She merely wanted pigeons, sparrows, and doves to be given to her as tribute from each house. The people obliged, gathering up the birds and handing them over. She then gave these birds one to each of her men in her army, and ordered them to attach a piece of string and a small satchel of sulphur to each bird, and when night fell, the birds were released to fly back to their nests in all the homes across the Drevlian capital, which I'm not going to try and pronounce again. The birds, of course, ignited each of these houses as many of the little packets of sulphur exploded, causing a massive blazing fire, which was not able to be extinguished due to the fact that so many buildings caught fire simultaneously, or more began to burn as the night went on. As the people attempted to flee the city, she ordered her soldiers to slaughter all who attempted to escape. Many were captured, put to death. Others were given away as slaves to many of her own acolytes as the part of their payment for this brutal campaign. The remainder were forced back into the box that they had been in before all this started. They were allowed to continue paying tribute, and the Drevlians became once again subservient to the Kievan Rus Empire. Seemingly at this point her lust for revenge had been satiated. She returned to her kingdom victorious. In case you're wondering why she is referred to as a saint, because I know I was when I first read about her, it is because, of course, these people were of a pagan nation back then. She was the first ruler of her people to adopt the Christian faith and begin the conversion process of her people. This also would lead to the Orthodox Church of Russia. Now, she is considered a saint, by the way, in both the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches, and it is mainly because she began the conversion process, although her son, who would be the future ruler, would remain pagan. She made no effort to convert him to her faith. What a good mother. Now, of course, I absolutely love this woman. She's amazing, and I have told my partner, if I'm ever murdered, I expect nothing less than the same level of revenge to be taken upon my enemies. Or buy herself a tank and stampede across enemy territory. Either way, I'll be happy. Dead, but happy. So, with that said, this rebel queen, this ruthless ruler, this relentless rebel, segueing sort of nicely and by force into my sponsor. As I said, this video is sponsored by Relentless Rebels. They provide Viking style jewelry as well as numerous others of their own design. They are linked in the description below. They have free international shipping, and if you use the promo code NERD20, all in capitals, you'll get a 20% discount on any of your purchases. So click the link below, check out their website, see if there's anything you might like, and get yourself a nice discount on it in the process. So, again, tell me in the comments below what you think of this woman, and would you like to see more of these biographies, because I would like to diversify this channel a little bit and pull myself away from doing nothing but Celtic videos that I know are very popular, but I do have a broad interest in history and would like to explore a few other things. Now, with all that said, if you made it to the end of the video, thank you for watching. It's very much appreciated. Also, I'm starting my own website, just thinking of it. Pops into my head. It is linked in the description below. It's still in its early stages of development, but there is now a Nerd.World Empire website, also linked in the description below if you want to check that out. And thank you for watching, and bye-bye.